what's wrong with the discourse of the Israeli ambassador to the US and to the UN when he says, like, there's no comparison. So, like, what's the problem with this? It also erases decades of Black and Palestinian solidarity historically, since the 1960s, okay? These ties run very deep. The Black Power movement in the 1960s actually issued the first significant statements in support of Palestinians that reached an American audience. And they did this because they were coming from this internationalist framework that was anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, and anti-racist. They extended solidarity to all oppressed peoples of the world, and they saw Palestinians actually as people of color fighting a liberation struggle against a global system of oppression. So the book Black Power and Palestine gives us a flavor of what that solidarity looked like. And if any of you guys are actually interested in this subject, I highly recommend that book to you. But I just wanted to share with you some of the quotes that came from some of these really leading Black figures in this time period. So Malcolm X, first of all, following a trip to Gaza in 1964, where he visited Palestinian refugee camps, he authored an article that was called Zionist Logic. And in that article, he questions whether, quote, the Zionists had the legal or moral right to invade Arab Palestine, uproot its Arab citizens from their homes, and seize all Arab property for themselves, just based on the religious claim that their forefathers lived there thousands of years ago. Only 1,000 years ago, Malcolm said, the Moors lived in Spain. Would this give the Moors of today the legal and moral right to invade the Iberian Peninsula, drive out its Spanish citizens, and then set up a new Moroccan nation where Spain used to be, as the Zionists have done to our Arab brothers and sisters in Palestine? End quote. Malcolm eventually concluded that the Zionist argument to justify Israel's present occupation of Arab Palestine has, quote, no intelligent or legal basis in history, not even in their own religion, end quote.
And that's putting it lightly.
I mean, honestly, like...
That's polite, Malcolm X.
It really
right?
is,
That's
right?
post-Mecca Malcolm X.
Yes. He was like toned down then.
Yeah, well, he was just more filled with compassion, I think.
Right?
Like his heart had grown in a way that it was colder before, and it was colder because of the circumstances he was subjected to by the United States government, the police force, Harlem police, etc.
Right. But it doesn't stop with Malcolm, right? Many of the Black Power activists, including members of the SNCC, were inspired by the work of the intellectual and psychiatrist Frantz Fanon, who came from Martinique, one of the French Caribbean islands. He's the author of The Wretched of the Earth, and he supported the Algerian resistance against French colonialism. But what's important to know about Frantz Fanon is that he really conceptualized this idea of the brotherhood between Arabs and Blacks, and the notion that because they were both subject to French colonialism, that they had this inherent connection with one another that was forged by resistance to colonial forces. And we can also look at a lot of the other Black Power organizations that were at the time issuing statements in the 60s condemning Israel's occupation of the Palestinian West Bank and Gaza. And get this, at that very time, they were having to make the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. You had Black Power activists coming out and saying, look, we condemn what Israel is doing in the West Bank and Gaza, but this condemnation does not imply anti-Semitism. So these activists were already fighting the same fight that we are fighting today, right? This idea that when you condemn the actions of a nation state that is actually carrying out a very real deprivation of rights for another people, that this is a legitimate exercise. This is a legitimate grievance that you are making, and that this is not in any way driven by an inherent hatred of the oppressor. It's driven by the fact that the oppressor is oppressing in that instance, right? It's not about you or your characteristics. It's just that you took my house.
Kweme Tori, formerly Stokely Carmichael, was very clear that Zionism is a branch of British imperialism and introduced a settler colonial state into the Middle East, right? On top of an existing indigenous population.
I have a great quote from him. He said, Israel is a settler colony. European Jews leave Europe, go to Palestine, change the name to Israel, expel the original inhabitants, the Palestinian Arabs, and dominate the land.
100%. Couldn't be clearer. And that's one of the leaders of the Black Liberation movement. I still get idiots in my comments coming and being like, what does he know about liberation? It's like, really? That's the angle you want to take?
Yeah, I mean, it's just not based in facts. So when you are coming from a place of principle and a place of, facts matter, then yeah. Yeah, I mean, what can you say to these people? Staying on Kweme Tori, he has another really, really, really amazing quote, which I really want to reflect on. He said, I have two dreams in my life. My dreams are rooted in reality, not imagery. I dream, number one, of having coffee with my South African wife in South Africa, and number two, of having mint tea in Palestine. I think for me, what he's touching on here is that when you are not free, when you don't have rights, the simple things in life are never guaranteed, because there's a system of oppression that is a daily reality to you that you have to navigate, that takes things as simple as having a cup of tea, and transforms them into these sort of, well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that. Am I going to, be back in time? Is the checkpoint going to hold me up? Am I going to get shot by an Israeli soldier? Am I going to have to stand in line for 6 hours? Am I going to, everything is subject to the arbitrary choice or decision of your colonizer, of your oppressor, of your dominator, of your colonial master. And you don't get to plan your life the way that you do if you live in a free society.
Certainly not if you live in the only democracy in the Middle East.
So here's the thing. We've already talked about how there's this historical reality of a Black Palestinian solidarity movement. But it's not only historical, it's also modern, and it exists today as well. Right. There was especially a resurgence of the Black Palestinian Solidarity movement that was reinforced following the murder of Michael Brown by Ferguson police in 2014. Now, this took place in parallel to Israel's military assaults on Gaza during that summer. And what you saw was a solidarity that was created whereby Palestinians who were protesting and who are accustomed to dealing with tear gas, and they know exactly what to do and how to treat it when the Israeli tear gas hits them, were tweeting and sending advice to protesters in Ferguson that were dealing with the highly militarized US police, which was also tear gassing protesters, right? And these alliances are being made at the grassroots level amongst individuals, but also institutions. Just take, for example, the 2015 Black Solidarity Statement with Palestine. It was signed by over 1,000 Black activists and scholars, including the founder of the Black Lives Matter movement. We also have, for example, Mark Lamont Hill, whose latest book, Except for Palestine, addresses the Palestinian exception to so-called progressive politics. And then very recently, Dr. Cornel West, who actually left Harvard following the university's refusal to grant him tenure for his belief that the ugly Israeli occupation of precious Palestinians is wrong. And that while his controversial and outspoken views about critiques of empire and capitalism and white supremacy and male supremacy and homophobia are tolerated, any serious engagement around the issues of the Israeli occupation are rendered highly suspect and reduced to anti-Jewish hatred and prejudice. So basically, Dr. West was more or less shown the boot by Harvard, and he ended up leaving, and it was because of his support for Palestinian human rights.
And not only was Dr. West robbed of tenure by Harvard, who had previously given him tenure, but he was robbed of the opportunity to be even considered for tenure, even though that is what the board had recommended. It's extremely rare that an institution doesn't grant tenure to somebody who's been recommended for tenure, right?
We also have Dr. Michelle Alexander, who's an incredible scholar and wrote the book, The New Jim Crow. She came out with an article in the New York Times where she said, look, we have to, with as much courage and conviction as we can, speak out against the system of legal discrimination that exists inside Israel. And she was talking about the system of apartheid that Israel's leading human rights organization now has finally called apartheid, right? Mm-hmm. So there's so many examples. Nelson Mandela, never forget that he told a crowd in Pretoria, South Africa in 1997 on the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people that we all know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians.
Yes. Desmond Tutu has been on record a number of times saying that Palestinians experience apartheid. And just recently this month, actually, Angela Davis said, and I quote, As someone who has long supported the Palestinian people, I know that we cannot capitulate here. The field of ethnic studies is not complete without the inclusion of content related to Palestine, Palestinians, and Palestinian-Americans. To attempt to erase Palestinians from the curriculum is to engage in an intellectual strategy that reiterates the non-recognition of Palestinians by the State of Israel, and is a part of the political process that Israeli historian Ilan Pappé refers to as ethnic cleansing. That's Professor Angela Davis on March 4th, 2021.
Yeah, that's, again, clear as day. I forgot to even mention the Palestinians, right, that are working and doing this work now. There's so many historically. The book goes into it. We don't have time to cover it, but like just in the modern sense, the legal scholar Noura Erakat, of course, has done a lot of work in this field. Ahmed Abu Znaid, also formerly of the Dream Defenders, and today the executive director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, also super active in the Black Palestinian solidarity movement. So these connections continue to be made. And, you know, as a Palestinian, I fiercely support all Black people and all people of color all over the world in their struggle for liberation, freedom, and equality, right? I mean, it's so, again, like, I feel like when I say this, like, it's so obvious. Like, why do we even have a podcast about this? Like,
so clear and logical and meaningful. I think that's why we have the podcast. One more thing about Angela Davis, though. Angela Davis did a panel maybe a year or so ago with my friend Heba Jamal. Shouts out Heba. And later, Angela Davis spoke the next day about how she was so inspired by this young Palestinian girl, and she meant Heba. And just think that that's so amazing that like all of our idol is inspired by one of our peers, right? And it's like Heba is amazing. She's doing great work. Follow her on all of her social medias. I'll put it all in right here. But just the idea that Angela Davis could be inspired by one of my friends, right? Makes me think that like the work that we're all doing is so important. And so shouts out to Heba, shouts out to Professor Angela Davis.
The power is always with the people and the people doing the work on the ground. Like, it's the Palestine Pod, Palestine Pod, Palestine Pod. Sit back and relax, Palestine Pod, Palestine Pod. Expand your mind, Palestine Pod.